Long after the war ended, the pine woods outside Macon, Georgia still held their secrets. On windless nights, locals swore you could hear humming from the riverbank, low, mournful, and sweet, as if a man were singing just beyond the veil of time. They said it was Ezekiel's song, a tune that once charmed 10 white men into silence. Nobody knew if Ezekiel was real, or if the story was born from guilt, the kind that rots a man's soul when justice is never done. But the older folks whispered that before the night the music came, a group of masked men went out drinking under a blood moon and never returned. The sheriff said they must have drowned, that the swamp took them. But the water was still, the ground dry. All that was found the next morning were 10 empty bottles, 10 burned hoods, and a humming that made the trees lean closer, as if listening. And from that night on, no one in those parts dared to sing after sundown. Ezekiel was born on the Harrow Plantation, a quiet stretch of land that bordered the Ocmulgee River. He was tall, soft-spoken, with eyes that caught light like amber glass. His mother had taught him to sing before he could walk. She used to say his voice was a blessing, a way to speak to heaven without begging. By the time he was 12, the mistress would make him sing during supper, his melodies drifting through the open windows while the family ate. His voice could smooth tempers, settle crying babies, and even make the old hound lie still. But to Ezekiel, it was never just a gift, it was a chain. Every song he sang belonged to someone else. When the war came, Harrow Plantation changed hands. The master left for battle and never came back. The mistress fled north. The enslaved were told they were free, but freedom was a word that came too late and too soft. Men in white hoods soon rode the roads where soldiers once marched. Ezekiel stayed near the river, earning pennies patching nets, playing his mother's songs at baptisms and burials. Folks said his voice could still any storm. But the world had grown cruel again, just wearing a different uniform. One hot night in August, he was called to sing at a small tavern on the edge of the pine woods. The air reeked of whiskey and sweat. 10 men sat at a table in the back, all wearing their work clothes, but their boots were clean, too clean, their faces half hidden in shadow. "Sing something pretty," one of them slurred, tossing a coin onto the floor. "Something fit for a white man's ears." Ezekiel hesitated, his fingers tight around the neck of his battered guitar. The room was quiet except for the buzzing of flies. He could smell kerosene on their sleeves and something colder underneath. He nodded once and began to play. His song was slow, sorrowful, the kind that starts in the bones and crawls upward until it fills the air. The chords trembled like rain over graves. His voice was deep, textured with years of grief and something older still, a rhythm born from pain but rising like prayer. As he sang, the men leaned back. One began to sway, another closed his eyes. The barkeep stopped polishing his glass. Even the insects seemed to fall quiet. When Ezekiel finished, no one clapped. The leader, a red-faced man with a scar cutting across his cheek, stared at him like he'd seen a ghost. "What you call that tune?" he asked. Ezekiel's voice was steady. "A song my mama taught me. She said it keeps the wicked from sleepin'." The men laughed, too loud, but their laughter faltered when he looked up at them calm, unflinching. Later that night, as the tavern emptied and the moon climbed high, Ezekiel walked alone down the river path. The trees whispered, the frogs sang, and his reflection followed him in the dark water. Behind him, he could still hear their laughter, but it was fading. He stopped and turned toward the sound. The night seemed to thicken, the air heavy with the scent of magnolia and gunpowder. He began to hum again, softer this time, a tune meant not for ears but for the earth itself. A breeze swept across the swamp, carrying the melody far into the woods. Somewhere deep among the pines, the laughter finally died. Ezekiel closed his eyes. "Sleep now," he murmured, his voice almost breaking. "Let the river keep what it's owed." When the sun rose the next morning, the river ran unusually clear. Fishermen said the water hummed not loud, but steady, like someone singing beneath the surface. And the Harrow lands, once loud with cruelty, were quiet at last. In the years that followed, children were warned, "Never hum by the Ocmulgee at night, or Ezekiel will finish your song for you." But some said his spirit still watched over the water, not as vengeance, but as promise, a reminder that even the enslaved, beaten, and voiceless once found ways to speak truth the world could not silence. The swamp keeps its secrets, and the song keeps its singer. And when the wind moves through the reeds, if you listen close enough, you can still hear his harmony. Weeks passed after that strange night at the tavern, and the town of Macon began to murmur about the disappearance of the 10 men who'd been drinking there. Their horses were found tied by the trees, their saddles still slick with sweat, but not one of the riders came home. Their wives lit candles, their sons searched the banks, and the sheriff rode the trails until his boots filled with mud. Nothing. The swamp had swallowed them whole, or so it seemed. But as summer dragged into the heavy breath of September, strange things began to happen on the old Harrow land. The first sign came to young Caleb, a freed boy who tended the fishing lines at dawn. He swore that one morning he heard someone humming from the water. Not just any humming, it was the same tune Ezekiel used to sing during work breaks, the one his mama called the morning song. At first, Caleb thought it was the wind slipping through the cattails, but the melody was too perfect, too human. When he looked out over the foggy river, he saw ripples forming in slow circles as if something beneath the surface was breathing. He ran all the way back to town, bare feet kicking up dust, shouting, "Ezekiel's down by the water. He's singing again." But when folks came to look, there was only stillness. No song, no ripples, just the low moan of wind through the cypress roots. Still, the whispers began. By the next Sunday, old women in church refused to walk near the river after dusk. The preacher told his congregation, "The Lord tests the wicked with signs," but even he avoided baptisms at the Akmalji after dark. The sheriff, a thick man with a handlebar mustache and a temper to match, grew tired of ghost tales. "You all talk like fools," he barked at the tavern one evening. "Men drink, men fight, men drown. Ain't no hauntin', ain't no song." But the barkeep wouldn't meet his eyes. "Maybe so," he muttered, wiping the counter. "But how come the frogs stop croaking every time that tune comes back?" The sheriff went quiet after that. Meanwhile, Ezekiel's small cabin near the pines stood empty. The door hung open, creaking with every shift of the wind. Inside, on the wooden table, lay his mother's old hymnal, a worn book with the cover half torn away. In the margins of one page, written in faded charcoal, were 6 words. "The river knows their names now. Nobody dared touch it." Some said Ezekiel had gone north with the freedmen's trains. Others claimed he'd been seen walking barefoot through the swamp under a harvest moon, singing to himself, his shadow stretching long and thin like smoke. The truth, no one knew. But fear has a way of becoming memory, and memory in the South never stays buried long. Then, one evening in late October, thunder rolled low over the horizon. The air was thick enough to choke on. A few of the local men gathered at the tavern to drink away the unease. Among them was Mr. Henry Clive, the younger brother of one of the missing men. He slammed his glass on the table. "Y'all can drink and whisper all you want, but I'm going down to that river tonight. I'll find the truth." The barkeep shook his head. "Ain't wise, Henry. That river don't give back what it takes." And Henry stood anyway, his face pale but set. "If that slave spirit's down there, I'll call him out myself." And so, with a lantern swinging at his side, he rode into the darkness alone. The storm broke before midnight. Lightning flashed, showing the swamp in bursts of white trees bowing, water shivering, the world holding its breath. When Henry reached the clearing by the river, he thought he saw movement. A figure, standing knee-deep in the water, humming softly. "Ezekiel," he called out. The humming stopped. For a heartbeat, there was only the hiss of rain and the groan of thunder rolling through the trees. Then the voice came soft, steady, the same voice that once filled the tavern. "Sleep now, child, the river's waitin'." Henry dropped the lantern. The flame sputtered, hissed, and died in the mud. By morning, the townsfolk found his horse tied to a tree, reins soaked and trembling. Henry was gone, and when the preacher came to bless the waters, he found something strange, the reflection of 10 white hoods floating beneath the surface, clear as day, though nothing rested there at all. After that, no one doubted Ezekiel's song. Some said he had made a pact that his voice carried the weight of every lash, every cry, every name that went unspoken. Others whispered that the river itself had chosen him, turning his sorrow into justice the world refused to give. Whatever the truth, the town learned one thing. When the wind hummed through the pines, you didn't listen too close. When the frogs went silent, you didn't linger near the water. And if you ever heard that low, trembling melody floating through the dark, you prayed it wasn't meant for you. By the spring of 1871, the story of Ezekiel, the singing slave who vanished into the swamp, had outgrown the town of Macon. It drifted like smoke through Georgia's borderlands, carried in whispers by travelers, by soldiers passing through, and by mothers who warned their children not to hum after sunset. They called it the Ballad of the Blood River. Every retelling grew darker. In one, Ezekiel was said to have charmed the Klansmen into dancing before they died. In another, he was a ghost who lured men to their watery graves with a tune sweeter than sin. The truth, if any truth remained, was hidden beneath the weight of myth and fear. And that was what brought Edward March, a young reporter from Philadelphia, to the edge of the Ocmulgee swamp. Edward wasn't like the locals. He wore polished boots and carried a fountain pen that glinted like a blade. He had written about railroads and politics, but what sold papers were ghosts, and the South had plenty of those. His editor had said, "Write me the truth, March, or write me a good lie. Either way, it'll sell." He arrived in Macon with a notebook, a pocket watch, and the kind of arrogance only outsiders possess. At first, no one would talk to him. They stared when he asked about the 10 missing men. They turned away when he mentioned the name Ezekiel. Finally, he found an old woman at the marketplace who spoke in a voice roughened by age and tobacco. Her name was Miss Alma, and her eyes were milk white, but they saw more than most. "You ain't here for truth," she told him, stringing beans with slow hands. "You here for a story. Truth don't sell half as pretty." Edward smiled politely. "Perhaps. But tell me what you know." Miss Alma leaned forward, the smell of smoke and salt on her breath. "I know that swamp ain't natural. The day they built the first slave pen there, the earth screamed. You can still hear it sometimes, if you listen between the cicadas. That boy Ezekiel, he just gave the land what it already wanted." Edward scribbled her words down, half believing, half amused. "And you think he's still there?" She nodded once. "You don't bury a song like that." That night, Edward checked into the old tavern, where the Klansmen had been seen last. The barkeep, a man named Sawyer, greeted him with wary eyes. "Best you leave that story alone," Sawyer said as he poured whiskey. "Ain't no glory in stirring up graves." Edward chuckled. "Graves don't scare me, Mr. Sawyer." "Maybe not," the barkeep replied, "but what sings in 'em might." When the lamps dimmed and the crickets rose, Edward sat alone by the window, tapping his pen. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the tree line, he thought he heard humming, slow, soft, low enough to be mistaken for wind. He told himself it was imagination, yet the sound lingered a melody that made the glass in his lamp tremble. At dawn, he rode toward the swamp. The air was heavy with dew. Cypress trees rose like sentinels, their roots coiled in black water. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. The frogs fell silent. Even his horse hesitated, snorting as if it smelled something wrong. Near the riverbank, Edward found what the locals had spoken of, a clearing where the water mirrored the sky so perfectly it looked like a second world below. There, on a half-sunken stump, lay something small, a piece of rusted metal, curved like a broken harmonica reed. He pocketed it, heart-thudding. Then came the humming. It began faint, from nowhere and everywhere at once, a voice without breath, deep and slow, rolling through the mist like thunder wrapped in honey. Edward froze. The hairs on his arms rose. "Who's there?" he called. No answer. Only the song rising now, shifting into the faint pattern of words. "They took my mother. They took my kin. Now the river take them in." Edward stumbled backward, his boots sinking into the muck. The sound wrapped around him, circling, tightening, like the air itself was alive. He dropped his notebook, tripping on a root, falling hard against the wet ground. When he looked up, he swore he saw something standing across the water, tall, dark, motionless. Not flesh, not shadow, A figure that shimmered like heat, its face blurred, its outline trembling. The humming stopped. Then, silence. Not the natural kind, but the kind that pressed on your chest until breathing felt like sin. Edward scrambled to his feet and fled. By the time he returned to town, the sun was up and his boots were caked with swamp mud. The people stared at him as he walked through the market, his hands shaking. He went straight to the tavern, ordered a whiskey, and said nothing. Sawyer, the barkeep, slid the glass toward him. "You heard it, didn't you?" Edward didn't answer. "You went in thinking you'd write a ghost story," Sawyer said softly. "Now you know the South don't make ghosts. It makes reckonings." That night, Edward packed his bags. He left before dawn, without saying goodbye to a soul. But he never published his article. Months later, a fisherman found his notebook washed up on the riverbank, pages swollen and torn. Only one line was still legible, written in ink that had run like blood through the paper. "He doesn't sing to haunt the living. He sings to remind the dead." By the summer of 1872, Ezekiel's song had become more than a ghost story. It was a curse, a hymn, and a warning. Folks said if you sang it after midnight, someone near you would die before dawn. Others claimed it healed wounds not of flesh, but of guilt. Nobody agreed on what the song did, only that it did something. Children hummed it under their breath when thunder rolled. Wives sang the first line while stirring soup, then stopped suddenly, as if remembering the cost. And every time someone drowned in the Okmulgee, people said, "He must have been humming Ezekiel's tune." One evening, at a small gathering outside Macon, a man named Caleb Ross played his fiddle while the freedmen danced. He was half drunk, half grieving, and too young to fear stories. When his bow slipped and the strings screeched, someone in the crowd laughed and shouted, "Play Ezekiel's song, Caleb. Let's hear the ghosts sing." Caleb grinned, foolish, proud, and began to hum. It started soft, almost pretty. The rhythm wasn't quite right, but the melody had a pull to it, like a river current dragging your feet. People stopped dancing. They turned toward him. The cicadas fell silent. By the time he reached the second verse, "Now the river take them in," the lantern flames began to flicker. The wind rose, carrying a low hum that came not from Caleb's throat but from the trees themselves. His bow snapped. Then came the scream. The crowd scattered, shouting and praying. Caleb stood frozen, his eyes wide, the fiddle still hanging from his neck. The next morning, they found him near the river. The strings of his instrument wound tight around his throat like a silver noose. After that, no one joked about the song again. Years passed. The war faded into history books. The fields grew quiet, but Ezekiel's melody stayed. It traveled from plantation to sharecropper camps, from church choirs to backroom blues sessions. Each singer added something new, a verse, a rhythm, a whisper. Some said it was a way of remembering pain. Others said it was a pact with vengeance. In 1881, a preacher named Reverend Elijah Booker tried to reclaim the song for salvation. He told his congregation that the devil had twisted a slave's mourning hymn into darkness, and he meant to turn it back to God. He stood before his flock under a pinewood roof and began to hum. The notes rolled slow and rich, echoing like a heartbeat through the rafters. The people closed their eyes and swayed, but when he reached the final line, "The river don't forgive, it just remembers," the floorboards cracked with a sound like thunder. A flood of red clay water burst through the church doors, sweeping benches aside. Lanterns fell, flames sputtered, people screamed. When the water receded, Reverend Booker was gone. Only his Bible remained, waterlogged and open to the book of Exodus. By the turn of the century, the tale had changed again. Now they said Ezekiel's ghost had been seen near the river on nights when the moon bled red. Some described him as a tall figure cloaked in fog, carrying a blade shaped like a scythe. Others swore he carried nothing but a song, and if you heard it, you'd see every sin you'd ever hidden. Old Miss Alma, still alive, somehow, half blind, half mad, told children stories of the singing shade. "Don't hum no tune you don't understand," she warned. That boy's song was made of blood and sorrow. Every note's a name of someone who wronged him. In 1903, A group of railroad workers camped near the old swamp. They laughed at the locals' superstitions, calling them old plantation tales. One of them, a man named Harlan Pike, played the harmonica and decided to test the story. He'd heard the melody from a kitchen girl who said her grandmother once knew Ezekiel. That night, he played the tune by the campfire. His men clapped, shouted, and drank as the wind carried the sound through the cypress trees. The melody bent and warped, its rhythm shifting, almost alive. Then, silence. The fire dimmed. The men's laughter turned uneasy. One by one, they vanished from the edge of the light, dragged backward, it seemed, into the dark water beyond the reeds. No splashes, no cries, just the hum. When morning came, all that remained were muddy boot prints leading toward the river and Harlan's harmonica, half buried in the silt. The song became forbidden. Parents told their children, "You can sing any hymn you please, but not that one." Musicians wrote it down under false titles: The Mourner's Lament, The Red River Tune, The Harmony of the Dead, but they never played it in full. Some bluesmen swore that if you played the true version, the strings on your guitar would snap one by one, like the breath leaving your body. And still, the legend grew. By the 1,920 seconds, when recording machines came south to capture authentic Negro spirituals, collectors kept hearing rumors of a song no one dared to perform. They called it Ezekiel's hymn. Every time they asked about it, the room went quiet. One collector, a man named Porter Gaines, pressed harder. He offered money, whiskey, even promises of fame. Finally, an old man in Savannah agreed to sing, but only if the recording was destroyed afterward. He sang 3 verses. The last note warped, and the phonograph needle snapped in half. The wax cylinder cracked down the middle. Porter Gaines suffered a stroke that same night. Before he died, he muttered 4 words that no one understood. He's still singing underwater. Even now, some say you can hear it not from men, not from records, but from the earth itself, when the rain falls hard enough to wake the swamp. The hum rises between thunderclaps, rolling low and endless, like breath through broken glass. And if you listen too long, you'll hear the rhythm underneath 10 slow beats. One for each man who thought they could drink, laugh, and kill without consequence. Ezekiel's song, they say, never ends. It just waits for someone foolish enough to sing along. By 1931, the South had changed its clothes, but not its soul. The plantations were smaller, the whips quieter, the fields filled with sharecroppers instead of slaves. But the ghosts, they still walked. And among those ghosts was a song nobody dared claim. That year, a traveling blues singer named Solomon "Sonny" Dupree stepped off a train in New Orleans with nothing but a broken guitar and a bottle of cheap gin. Folks said he could make a crowd cry or dance with the same 12 bars. But what made him different was the tune he carried, a melody he'd heard as a boy from his grandmother, who warned him never to play it whole. She said it belonged to a man named Ezekiel, Sonny once told a fellow musician, a slave who sang death itself into the night. The other man laughed. "Ain't no song can kill nobody." Sonny smiled. "Then you ain't heard the right one." Sonny was restless. He'd played every juke joint from Baton Rouge to Mobile, but when he reached the French Quarter, something drew him to a rundown recording studio on Dauphine Street. Its owner, Mr. Tully Graves, was a white man with slick hair, a grin too wide, and a hunger for Negro sound. He'd recorded dozens of singers, most of whom vanished back into the dust after one record. When Sonny walked in, Tully looked him over and said, "You look like a man with a story." "I got a song," Sonny replied, "but you might not want to hear it." Tully laughed. "If it sells, I want to hear it." They recorded late that night. The air was thick, the walls sweating with summer heat. Sonny sat before the microphone, his thumb brushing the strings like a heartbeat. He played slow, heavy, each chord dragging something invisible into the room. "Name of the tune?" Tully asked from behind the glass. Sonny hesitated. "The Swamp Lament," he said finally, the name his grandmother used when she refused to speak the true one. The tape rolled. Sonny began to hum low at first, then higher, until his voice was no longer his own. The sound filled the studio like smoke. The engineer swore later that the lights dimmed, and he heard whispering behind the walls. One of the strings on Sonny's guitar snapped midway through, but he kept playing, his voice rising above the hiss. When the final note hit, Thule sat frozen. The reel stopped on its own. "Jesus," the engineer whispered. "What was that?" Sonny wiped sweat from his brow. "Ain't mine," he said quietly. "Never was." Tully printed 20 copies of the record, convinced it would make him rich. But strange things followed. The first copy, sent to a radio station in Biloxi, caused the equipment to spark when the DJ tried to play it. The second, mailed to Memphis, arrived, warped, melted, though it had never touched heat. By the time the 10th record reached Atlanta, the man who opened the box was found dead at his desk, head tilted back, mouth open, as if he'd been singing. Tully tried to destroy the rest, but the power went out that night. When the lights returned, Sonny was gone, his guitar leaning against the door, one string missing. The master reel had disappeared. Weeks later, the song began to appear in strange places. Travelers swore they heard it drifting from old radios that weren't plugged in. A maid in Savannah said she heard her gramophone playing at midnight, but when she looked, the record wasn't spinning. And in a dusty bar outside Jackson, an old man stumbled in one evening, wild-eyed, carrying a cracked vinyl sleeve. "I found it," he rasped. "I found Ezekiel's song." He dropped the record on the counter. The barkeep looked no title, just a faint engraving on the label. "E.Z. River Take Them In." They played it once. Every mirror in the place shattered. Soon, the rumors spread north. Chicago bluesmen whispered about the cursed track. They said Robert Johnson himself refused to cover it, not because he feared the devil, but because that tune already had one. In juke joints, if a guitarist accidentally fell into the melody, the crowd went still until he changed chords. In the Mississippi Delta, people nailed crosses over door frames when the wind carried a certain rhythm through the trees. By 1935, the story reached the newspapers. "Mysterious deaths linked to haunted record," read one headline in the Times-Picayune. Thule Graves was found dead soon after, slumped over his desk with headphones on, the reel-to-reel spinning out silence. The coroner said his heart stopped mid-beat, though his face was turned upward, smiling. The police destroyed the tapes, or so they claimed. But Ezekiel's song, it didn't need vinyl or tape anymore. It had entered the air, the wires, the pulse of the South itself. People said if you turned your radio dial between stations, you might catch a faint hum beneath the static, a man's voice singing slow and low, the same phrase over and over. "The river don't forgive, it remembers." And, in 1941, a new blues singer performed on a live broadcast in Alabama. Halfway through his set, the band stopped. The singer froze, then began humming a melody no one recognized. The sound crackled through radios across 3 states. Listeners said they could hear water dripping and faint whispering behind the music. He died 2 days later, drowned in a well with no water. Decades later, collectors still search for that record. They call it the 12th song, believing 11 known copies existed before the master vanished. But the 12th, they say, was never pressed by human hands. It just appears sometimes in pawn shops, in attics, in boxes of forgotten 78 seconds. Those who play it don't live to tell what they heard. And somewhere, maybe in the deep swamp where it began, the wind still hums a melody older than pain, a song made from chains, blood, and revenge. They say if you listen long enough, you'll hear Ezekiel counting softly, patiently waiting for his harmony to begin again. By the summer of 1963, the South was once again burning, not from plantation torches this time, but from buses, protests, and hatred wearing badges instead of hoods. In Montgomery, a young woman named Loretta Mayfield walked with the marchers every morning. She carried no gun, no shield, only a small radio that hung from her shoulder by a frayed strap. She kept it tuned low, to the local gospel station, because the music steadied her hands when the police dogs barked. But one morning, as the marchers gathered on Dexter Avenue, the broadcast changed. No preacher, no sermon, Just static, then a faint hum beneath it. A man's voice, low and rich, sliding through the air like a whisper from another century. The river don't forgive. It remembers. Loretta froze. Her breath caught like a knot in her throat. The others marched on, shouting, "Freedom now!" But she stood still, the radio trembling in her hands. She had heard that melody before. Her grandmother, Miss Odetta, used to sing it when the nights grew long and the wind rattled the shutters. But she'd always stop before the last verse. "That's not ours to finish," she used to say. "That belongs to a man who sang death into the swamp." As a child, Loretta thought it was just an old warning, a ghost story passed through the bones of slavery. But now, nearly 100 years later, that same voice was on her radio, alive again. That night, she walked to the local field office, where organizers huddled under dim light, printing flyers for the next march. "You all hear that song today?" she asked. One man looked up. "You mean the one that cut through the broadcast?" Another nodded. "Yeah, thought it was a glitch. Made my teeth hurt." Loretta set her radio on the table. "It ain't no glitch. It's him." They stared at her. "Him who?" "The slave," she whispered. "The one they say sang before the killings." Someone laughed nervously. "You talkin' hoodoo now, girl." But Loretta didn't blink. "Maybe so. But if the dead got something to say, I think it's time we listen." 2 nights later, as the marchers gathered again, Loretta turned the dial of her radio, and there it was. The hum. The same rhythm that pulsed like footsteps on wet earth. She began to hum along, not out of fear, but out of recognition. One by one, others joined. The sound rolled through the crowd low, mournful, but strong. It wasn't, "We shall overcome." It wasn't gospel. It was something older. The police thought it was a chant, but it wasn't. It was a curse turned into courage. The next morning, newspapers ran the headline, "Unknown song rises from marchers, police back away." Reporters said the crowd's humming seemed to shake the air. Officers who'd raised their batons suddenly froze, staring into nothing. One described hearing a man's voice from nowhere whisper in his ear, "You still got blood on your hands." When the march ended, not one baton had swung. Loretta didn't tell them what she'd seen. A shimmer of water running down the street, though it hadn't rained in days, and a faint figure in the crowd, tall, dark, barefoot, humming with them. Ezekiel. By 1965, the song had traveled north. At rallies in Selma, Jackson, and Birmingham, crowds began humming it when police formed their lines. Radio stations tried to trace where it came from, but no recording could capture it. When they pressed the button to record, the tape hissed and melted. A historian in Atlanta claimed he'd found an old transcription, "EZ River Take Them In," from the 1,930 seconds, the same phrase scratched on a cracked vinyl decades earlier. He wrote an article calling it "The Lost Blues of Ezekiel." 2 days after publishing, his house burned to the ground. The fire chief said the blaze began from inside his record player. But the movement didn't stop singing. Loretta had turned the song into a kind of weapon, a rhythm that haunted those who'd spilled blood. When the Ku Klux Klan tried to intimidate her marchers one night near Selma, they surrounded them instead, hundreds of voices humming in harmony. The men in white robes froze. Their torches flickered and went out. A wind rushed across the field, carrying the melody. One by one, the Klansmen dropped their torches and ran. Afterward, Loretta looked up at the night sky and whispered, "Thank you, Ezekiel." In 1968, after Dr. King's assassination, the song went silent. Radios stopped catching its signal. The marches turned to riots, the harmony to noise. Loretta returned to Montgomery, older, tired, her radio long broken. But some nights, when thunder rolled over the Alabama hills, she swore she could still hear him, that same voice, steady as a drumbeat. The river don't forgive. It remembers. 50 years later, in 2018, a graduate student named Maya Dupree, great-granddaughter of the blues singer who'd recorded The Swamp Lament, discovered an unmarked file buried in the Library of Congress archives. No label, no record number, just static and faintly, underneath, a voice humming. When she played it through modern software, She found the impossible. A layered waveform of human breath and water movement, pulsing like a heartbeat. When she slowed it down, she heard words, not from the 1800s, not from the 1,930 seconds. From right now, keep singing. The song ain't done. Maya still studies that recording. She says sometimes, when she listens too long, her computer screen fogs over, and from her window, she swears she sees ripples spreading through the puddles outside as if someone unseen were walking through water. The song that began in chains now moves through wires, through frequencies, through air. It has outlived its enemies, its victims, even its own curse. And somewhere, beyond the reach of fear or vengeance, Ezekiel hums not for blood now, but for balance. Because as long as the river remembers, so will the song. The rain had been falling for 3 straight days when Maya Dupree finally found the grave. It wasn't marked with a headstone, just a row of uneven stones near the Atchafalaya River, half swallowed by moss and roots. Locals said the river changed course here every few decades, washing away whatever memories dared to settle too close. But one patch of ground had resisted it all. The grass grew thick, dark, almost blue in the twilight. That was where she stopped. The air was heavy with that swamp smell, wet iron, old wood, and secrets that refused to stay buried. Maya's boots sank an inch into the mud as she knelt and brushed away the weeds. Beneath the dirt was something smooth, curved, carved with a single letter, E. She exhaled sharply. "Ezekiel," she whispered. Her research had led her here through records burned and rewritten, letters tucked into hymnals, prison logs that called him Ezekiel, the singing devil. But no document mentioned where his body lay. Now she knew. The river had kept him. As thunder rolled across the bayou, Maya set her recorder on the ground beside the grave. The screen flickered. "This is Maya Dupree," she said softly. "Field recording number 42. Subject suspected resting place of Ezekiel, also known as the Swamp Singer." Her voice shook as she added, "If this is truly his grave, I just want to hear the song again." She pressed record. For a moment, nothing, only the buzz of insects, the lazy drip of water from leaves. Then, faintly, came a hum, so low she thought it was her imagination at first. But it grew not from the air, not from the trees from beneath her. Maya froze. The recorder's display began to spike with sound waves. Her hands trembled. The hum turned into a note, deep and mournful, rising like a slow tide. "The river don't forgive," the voice murmured. Her breath caught. It was the same phrase she'd heard in the old file, but now it was alive, textured, full of something more than sorrow. The voice carried resolve. Then, the verse changed. A new line one never recorded before spilled through the air. "But it remembers to heal." Lightning cracked. The ground shuddered. Water seeped from the earth, crawling up through the grass in ripples. Maya stumbled back, eyes wide. The puddles around the grave glowed faintly, forming circles that pulsed like heartbeats. Her recorder blinked wildly, 99% memory full. The audio bars danced, and then she saw him. Not flesh, not ghost, something in between. A shimmer shaped like a man, tall and calm, his eyes glinting silver in the rain. His mouth moved with the rhythm of the song, but no words came out. Still, she felt them inside her chest, like a second heartbeat syncing with her own. Maya whispered, "Ezekiel?" The figure inclined his head. His outline wavered like heat rising off the river. She felt neither fear nor cold, only the weight of witnessing something the earth had tried to forget. He gestured toward the recorder, then toward the water. She understood. Kneeling again, she placed the recorder in the puddle at his feet. The screen filled with static, then black. But through her own ears, the song continued clearer, fuller. There were harmonies now, dozens of voices rising behind his. Men, women, children, the enslaved and the free, the living and the dead. It was no longer a lament. It was a hymn. "Lay down the chains," the river said. "Lay down the hate. The blood's been shed. The voice that killed now sings instead. And peace walks where we bled." Maya's tears mixed with the rain. She wanted to ask what it meant, why her, Why now? But the words dissolved in her throat. The figure slowly faded, his body scattering into the rain like ash. The humming lingered a moment longer, then stopped. When she returned to her hotel that night, the recorder wouldn't turn on. The battery was fried, the card unreadable. Yet when she played the last saved file on her laptop, the sound that emerged was not static. It was water, and beneath it, barely audible, a heartbeat. She watched the waveform scroll across the screen. The pulse matched her own. That's when she realized Ezekiel's final verse hadn't been for the world. It had been for the bloodline that carried his memory, the descendants of those who'd hummed his song through pain and fire. Her great-grandmother, her grandmother, her. Maya leaned back in the chair, whispering through her tears. The river remembers. Weeks later, Maya published her findings, or tried to, but every file she sent corrupted, every email vanished. So she printed the transcript, sealed it in a tin box, and buried it near the river where she'd found the grave. Before she left, she spoke one final line into the wind. "Your song's safe now, Ezekiel." The wind shifted warm this time, not stormy. Cypress leaves danced gently above her, and for a brief instant, she heard the faint hum of approval carried across the water. A year later, during a drought, a group of children playing near the same stretch of river found something strange. A tin box, rusted shut. Inside a scrap of soaked paper with only one line legible, "The river don't forgive, but it remembers to heal." The children, not understanding, read it aloud together. Their laughter echoed through the trees, and the air seemed to shimmer. Far downstream, an old fisherman looked up from his boat, hearing a melody ripple through the current, faint, ancient, and at peace. He smiled and said softly to no one, "Sing on, son, sing on." It was 150 years after Ezekiel's last verse when the song returned to the world. Not through ghosts or graves this time, but through speakers, cell phones, and a woman's trembling voice on a stage lit by golden light. The auditorium was filled to the brim, journalists, students, professors, and locals from the Louisiana bayou towns. At the center stood Dr. Maya Dupree, now older, her once black curls streaked with silver. She wore a simple white dress, its hem embroidered with river reeds, a nod to where it had all begun. She tapped the microphone. "Can you all hear me?" A ripple of murmured yeses. "Good. Then let me tell you a story." Behind her, a screen flickered on an image of the Atchafalaya River, gleaming under a twilight sun. The caption read, "Ezekiel, the Swamp Singer." Maya inhaled deeply. For generations, this name lived only in whispers, a warning, a myth, a curse. But he wasn't a monster. He was a man who sang truth into terror, a man who turned music into rebellion. She paused, letting the silence grow thick. And his song didn't end with him. A hush fell as she pressed play. From the speakers came a sound no one expected, not blues, not gospel, not anything familiar. It was layered, male and female voices rising in harmony, humming like water moving through roots. Each verse carried a rhythm that felt ancient yet alive, like something the earth itself was remembering. "Lay down the chains," the river said. "Lay down the hate. The blood's been shed." The crowd didn't move. Some cried without knowing why. Maya continued softly. "This recording somehow existed inside the corrupted memory card I recovered 12 years ago. The files were broken, impossible to open. Until last year, when a student of mine, a descendant of a Confederate soldier, volunteered to help restore the data." She smiled faintly at the young man sitting in the front row. "Turns out, healing begins when enemies listen together." Iv Willie. When the song ended, there was no applause. Just stillness, the kind that comes when everyone in a room feels something holy. An older woman in the back stood slowly. "My great-grandfather. He was one of the Klansmen in that story," she said, voice trembling. "I grew up ashamed, trying to forget. But this," her voice cracked, "this makes me want to remember, just so I can help it never happen again." Maya nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. That's what Ezekiel wanted. The river never forgave, but it remembered to heal. After the event, people lingered outside beneath the willow trees that lined the university courtyard. A warm wind drifted from the bayou, carrying the faint scent of rain and something older. Strangers hugged, shook hands, and shared quiet confessions about ancestors long buried in shame or sorrow. One man, tall, freckled, with eyes like cold river water, approached Maya as she packed her things. "My name's Robert Langtree," he said. "My family owned one of the plantations Ezekiel worked on." Maya stiffened slightly, but Robert continued before she could speak. "I found his name in our ledgers. And I found something else, a letter. My great-great-grandfather's. He wrote that he heard a slave sing the night the fire took the barn. Said it was the most beautiful and terrifying sound he'd ever heard." He reached into his coat and handed her a folded piece of paper. The edges were brittle, yellowed. Inside, written in ink that had barely survived the century, was a single sentence. The man sang like he was already free. "Axes." Maya closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Robert hesitated. "Can I ask you something? Do you think he forgave us?" She looked toward the dark river beyond the trees. "I think forgiveness isn't something the river gives," she said. "It's something we earn by listening to its song." Months later, Maya and a group of students founded the Ezekiel Project, a cultural initiative dedicated to preserving songs of resistance, survival, and freedom. They began recording voices from across the South, descendants of enslaved people, former Klansmen's families, Native communities, Creole elders. What emerged wasn't just a music archive. It was a chorus. Songs that once belonged to the oppressed were now sung by the descendants of both the oppressed and the oppressors together. At the first festival, hundreds gathered along the banks of the Atchafalaya. They sang Ezekiel's hymn as the sun set, voices blending into one vast, trembling note that rippled across the water. Children danced barefoot in the mud. Old men wept quietly, and when the final verse came, "And peace walks where we bled," everyone fell silent. For a long moment, the river seemed to answer with its own gentle murmur, as if humming along. Late that night, after everyone had gone, Maya stood alone at the edge of the water. She whispered the verse once more, feeling it settle deep in her chest. Then she heard it faint but real, a single humming voice just beyond the reeds, low, warm, and familiar. She didn't look for its source. She didn't have to. Instead, she smiled through her tears and said, "Sing on, Ezekiel. We're listening." The river shimmered under the moonlight, as if bowing in gratitude. The wind carried a whisper across its surface, not words, but music. And though no one recorded it, every person who had ever heard his song swore they could still feel it sometimes in the hum of the bayou, the rhythm of the rain, the laughter of children learning the hymn anew. Because some songs don't end. They just change singers. And the world bruised, haunted, healing keeps time with their rhythm.